The unlikely awakening, 5 to 7 minute hook. The spaceship drifted through the cold emptiness of space, far away from any planet or civilization. Inside the ship, the Quran, a race of advanced aliens, studied the stars, their glowing screens filled with data from the vast universe. They were explorers, conquerors, and yet they had never encountered something like this before. Captain Varker stood at the helm, his many eyes scanning the stars. His ship, the Erlath, was a magnificent vessel, capable of traveling faster than light, filled with alien technology far beyond the human understanding. Yet, as powerful as they were, the Quran had come across an ancient Earth ship floating in the vast emptiness, seemingly abandoned. Its hull was damaged, covered in scars of age, and its communication systems were long silent. "This ship is ancient," Varker said, turning to his second-in-command, Turi, who stood by his side. "It has been drifting for centuries, but it's still operational, just barely." Turi's voice crackled as he ran a scan. "There's a human on board." Varker turned sharply. "A human?" he repeated in disbelief. "How is that possible? The humans were wiped out centuries ago." The Quran had once fought humanity in a war that spanned across many planets, but humanity's resistance had been crushed, or so the Quran believed. The human race had been wiped from the galaxy, or so the record stated. Yet here it was, a ship from Earth, carrying one surviving human. With curiosity and an unspoken sense of dread, Varker gave the order to board the Earth ship. His crew suited up in their protective armor, ready to explore this relic from a long-dead species. They made their way through the ship, their footsteps echoing in the silent halls. The air inside was cold, stale, and filled with a sense of abandonment. They found the Cryo chamber at the heart of the ship. A single human in suspended animation lay inside, preserved in a state of deep sleep. The human's face was pale, eyes closed, and the body was almost entirely motionless. "Is it alive?" Turi asked, his voice filled with both awe and caution. Varker moved closer to the Cryo chamber. "It's alive, but in stasis. We'll awaken it and learn what we can." The Quran captain activated the chamber, and with a soft hiss, the glass dome began to rise. The human's body shifted slightly, and for a moment, there was nothing but stillness. Then, slowly, the human's eyes flickered open. At first, the human seemed disoriented, blinking rapidly as they tried to make sense of their surroundings. The Quran stared at the human, waiting for a reaction. It was clear this human had no idea where they were, but the fear was already setting in. They looked around, taking in the strange, alien ship, and their eyes fell on the Quran. Varker spoke first, his voice calm yet filled with an edge. "We come in peace. You've been asleep for a long time, human. We are the Quran, explorers of the galaxy. You've been found." The human's gaze sharpened. There was no sign of panic, only a steady, calculating look as they assessed the situation. In that brief moment, Varker felt a shiver run down his spine. The human wasn't afraid, something he had expected. Turi moved to speak, but the human interrupted. In broken, harsh words, the human said, "Where am I?" Varker motioned to the ship's vast control panel. "You are aboard our vessel. You were discovered in an ancient ship from Earth." The human's eyes widened slightly at the mention of their home planet. "Earth." Their voice trailed off, as if remembering something lost to time. The Quran were patient, awaiting a response, but the human remained silent, their gaze flickering between the Quran, the strange technology surrounding them, and the remains of their old ship. It was clear they were processing the strange new world they had awakened into. Minutes passed, and the silence grew thick. Varkur, growing impatient, gestured to Turi. "Why isn't it responding?" "I don't know, Captain. It's strange. I expected more fear," Turi replied, watching closely as the human studied them. But then, without warning, the human moved. In a flash, the human's hand darted out, swiping across the controls of the ship. activating the ship's emergency lights. A bright red glow filled the room, casting an eerie hue across the faces of the Quran. The humans' quick movement had taken them by surprise, and before the Quran could react, the human had already reached for a nearby weapon, a discarded alien gun. Varker's eyes widened. What is it doing? The human held the gun with unshaken confidence, aiming it directly at Varker. Their voice, though raspy, held strength. Don't make a move. The Quran were stunned. The human, who should have been weak from centuries of sleep, was anything but. They seemed calm, focused, and most surprisingly, defiant. The Quran had made a grave mistake. Lower the weapon, human. Varker commanded, his voice tense. We are not your enemies. But the human didn't move. Instead, they slowly backed away, scanning the room, the Quran, and everything around them. In that moment, it was clear. This human was no ordinary being. Something inside them had changed, something far more dangerous than the Quran could have ever expected. And as the tension in the room grew, one thought crossed the minds of the Quran. We've made a terrible mistake. The human's first move. The room was tense, filled with the low hum of the alien ship systems and the faint sounds of the human breathing steadily. The Quran were still stunned by the humans' quick reflexes and the calmness in their eyes as they stood with the gun in hand. It was clear that something was different about this human. They were no ordinary survivor of the long-forgotten war. Varkor took a step forward, his many eyes narrowing. He had never expected this response. The human, instead of trembling in fear or begging for mercy, appeared to be sizing them up, studying the situation with a strange intensity. You're making a mistake, Varkor said slowly, trying to remain calm. We have no intention of harming you. We saved you. The human's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Saved me. Their voice was hoarse, but it carried authority. I don't need saving. Varker's eyes flickered with unease. He had expected the human to be scared, confused, even helpless. But instead, this human was confident, defiant. The Quran had expected an easy encounter. Perhaps the human would provide them with information about Earth or tell them of the history of their kind. But instead, they had woken up a creature who seemed to have the power to take control of the situation. With a swift motion, the human lowered the weapon, but did not release it. The Quran noticed a subtle shift in their posture. No longer the disoriented figure they had first seen, but someone who had regained control of their mind and body. I don't know how you found me, the human said, glancing around the alien ship. But if you think you can control me, you're wrong. The Quran were silent. Varkor exchanged a glance with Turi, who seemed just as unsettled. They had expected to find a vulnerable being, one they could easily study, perhaps even use. But this human was something entirely different, unpredictable, and clearly capable of fighting back. Why did you awaken me? The human asked, their eyes shifting between the Quran. There was no fear in their voice, only a cold curiosity. What do you want? Varkor cleared his throat, his voice steadying. We are explorers, curious about your kind. You were once part of the war that shaped the galaxy. We want to know more. We seek knowledge. The human's eyes narrowed. The war, they murmured, almost as if remembering something long buried. And now you're playing the part of saviors. Varkor stiffened. We are not your enemies, human. We are simply interested in your history, your technology, and your people. The human stared at him, then glanced over at the alien ship's advanced control panels. Their expression shifted, no longer confused, but alert and calculating. They seemed to be weighing the situation, as though deciding whether the Quran were telling the truth or just spinning lies. Turi, who had been quietly observing the human's every movement, finally spoke up. Captain, this human. Something is off. It's not reacting the way we expected. Varkor nodded. He was beginning to realize that this human might be more than he had bargained for. The Quran had fought humanity once before and wiped them out, or so they thought. Yet here was a survivor, one who had somehow survived all this time in cryo sleep, perhaps longer than any human should have. The human turned back to them. "You woke me up for a reason," they said, their voice growing colder. "But you've made a mistake." Varkor frowned. "What mistake?" The human gave a small, knowing smile. "The mistake of thinking you could control me, or any human for that matter." Turi looked at the captain, confused. "Captain, should we?" Before Turi could finish his sentence, the human suddenly moved, faster than either of the Quran could react. In an instant, they had crossed the distance between them, their hands grabbing hold of a piece of alien technology lying nearby. A glowing blade, sharp and dangerous, was pulled from its sheath. "You don't get it, do you?" The human's voice grew colder. "I don't want your freedom. I don't need it. What you're offering isn't what I want. You're playing a dangerous game with me, and you don't even realize it." Varkor's muscles tensed. He could feel the weight of the human's words pressing down on him, but he couldn't let his guard down. "We will make you an offer you can't refuse, human. You will tell us what we need to know, your technology, your history, and we will release you. You'll be free to go wherever you choose." The human's expression didn't change. They simply raised an eyebrow and glanced around the ship. "You think I'm a prisoner here? Let me make something clear. You're not in control. You never were." The words were so simple, but the impact was undeniable. Varkor felt a chill crawl down his spine. The human wasn't just defying them. They were questioning everything the Quran stood for. The thought of their superiority was being challenged, not by a fellow conqueror, but by a single, seemingly insignificant human. The human took another step forward, closing the gap between them. "You woke me from cryo sleep, thinking I was weak. That's your mistake. You thought I was a relic, something from the past. But I'm not. I'm the future. And you, Varkor, will soon learn that you can't control me." Turi's eyes widened in disbelief. "This human is insane, Captain. They're dangerous." Varkor didn't respond at first. He was still processing the human's words, but a growing realization was dawning on him. The human wasn't just a survivor. They were a survivor with a purpose. A survivor who, despite everything that had happened to their kind, was still fighting. The Quran had underestimated the human race, and now they were about to pay the price. The room was silent again, but the tension in the air was palpable. It was as though time itself had slowed. Varkor's mind raced as he weighed his next move. Should they force the human to comply, or should they try to understand this new, unpredictable force they had awakened? For the first time in a long while, the Quran captain was unsure. The human in front of him was more than he could handle alone. "Listen carefully, human," Varkor finally said, his voice steady, though he couldn't hide the growing unease. "You may think you control the situation, but you don't. We are the Quran, and we always win." The human's lips curled into a small, cold smile. "We'll see about that." And with that, the human stepped back, raising the glowing blade once more, ready to fight if needed. It was clear now that the Quran had no idea what they had truly unleashed. The game was on. The price of underestimating humans. The air inside the alien ship was thick with tension as the human, now fully aware of the power they possessed, stood poised with the glowing blade. Varkor could feel the weight of his decision pressing on him like a mountain. He had awakened this human, assuming that they were a relic of the past, an easy pawn to study and use. But instead, the human had become the ultimate challenge. The human's eyes locked with Varkor's, their cold, calculating stare piercing through him. "You think you have the upper hand, don't you?" The voice was laced with quiet menace, yet there was an underlying calmness to it that sent a shiver down Varkor's spine. "You woke me from cryo sleep, thinking I was just a fossil, an ancient warrior with nothing left to give. But what you don't understand is that I've lived through things you could never imagine." Turi stepped forward, his voice anxious. "Captain, we must act quickly. If this human is a threat, We need to neutralize them before they take control of our ship. Varkor held up a hand to silence his officer. He knew the Quran couldn't afford to make another rash move. The humans' defiance had already shown them that they were not dealing with a simple survivor. They were dealing with a force of nature. "Why are you doing this?" Varkor demanded, trying to regain control of the situation. "We're offering you freedom. We only need answers. You could help us understand everything about your people, your history, your technology." The human's lips curled into a slight smile. "Help you?" They laughed bitterly. "You don't want help. You want to control what's left of us. You want to use our technology, our knowledge to further your conquest." Varkor's frustration grew. He had no intention of controlling the human. He just wanted the power of their species. The Quran had been ruthless conquerors for centuries, wiping out entire races to expand their empire. But this human was different. They were speaking of the Quran as if they were the ones who were vulnerable. "You don't know what you're up against," Varkor said through gritted teeth. "We are the Quran. We've destroyed entire civilizations. Your kind has no chance of surviving this encounter." The human didn't flinch. Instead, they seemed to take a deep breath, almost as if they were readying themselves for what was to come. The blade in their hand hummed softly, the light from the alien technology reflecting off of its surface. "I've seen civilizations fall," the human said quietly. "I've seen people destroyed. But the one thing you're forgetting is this: humans never back down. We don't surrender. We fight. Even when it seems impossible. You think your technology, your weapons can defeat us, but it's your arrogance that will be your downfall." Varkor's pulse quickened. He had underestimated this human, and now he was beginning to understand just how big of a mistake that had been. He had no idea what the human was capable of. But one thing was clear: they were no longer the pawn in the Quran's game. They were the player. "Then show me," Varkor sneered, trying to assert dominance. "Prove to me that you are a threat. Let's see if you can survive this." In a swift motion, Varkor reached for a control panel on his side, activating the hidden defense system that unleashed a barrage of energy blasts. The air around them buzzed with the crackling sound of charged energy, and Varkor watched as the beams shot toward the human, confident that their advanced alien technology would overwhelm the fragile human form. But instead of dodging or running, the humans stood their ground, their eyes narrowing with intense focus. The energy beams collided with the human's body, but instead of disintegrating them as Varkor had anticipated, the human simply absorbed the impact. The Quran stood in stunned silence. Their weapons, designed to obliterate entire ships and planets, had done nothing but momentarily stagger the human. The human's clothes were singed, their bodies slightly scorched, but they stood tall, unfazed. The blade in their hand glowed brighter, crackling with energy, as if it had somehow absorbed the energy from the blasts. "Is that all you've got?" the human asked, their voice calm, but with a deadly edge. "You really thought that would stop me?" Varkor's mind raced. What kind of human was this? How could they survive such an assault? His advanced technology, his most powerful weapons, had been ineffective against the human. It was as though they were untouchable, unkillable. It defied all logic. Turi took a cautious step back. "Captain, this isn't possible. This human is beyond anything we've faced before." Varkor's eyes darted to the ship's control panel. The system was still in place, ready to unleash another round of energy blasts. But for the first time in his life, Varkor hesitated. Could they risk using more power against the human? What if they destroyed themselves in the process? The human's smirk grew wider. "You should have learned your lesson. You can't control us. Not now. Not ever." Varkor's mind whirled, trying to formulate a plan, but the human was right. They had no idea what they had unleashed. The idea of domination, of ruling the galaxy with the Quran's might, seemed hollow now. The human was no longer just a target. They were a challenge, one the Quran might not be able to overcome. In that moment, Varkor realized that this wasn't just about knowledge or technology anymore. It was about survival. The human had shown them that there were things in the universe more powerful than the Quran, things they had never fully understood. The human's eyes glinted with something dangerous, something that sent a chill down Varkor's spine. "You'll regret underestimating us." And then, without warning, the human lunged forward, blade raised. The Quran were about to face a fight unlike any they had ever known. The breaking point. The Quran ship hummed with tension as the human moved with a speed and precision that left the aliens in a state of disbelief. Varkor's crew, once so confident in their superiority, now found themselves struggling to keep up. The humans' movements were swift, calculated, and deadly. Varkor stepped back, eyes never leaving the human as they advanced. The glowing blade in their hands crackled with energy, its sharp edge gleaming in the dim light of the control room. The Quran captain's mind raced, searching for an escape, a countermeasure, anything that could tip the scales back in their favor. But each time the human struck, his plan seemed to unravel even faster. Turi shouted from the back, his voice laced with fear. "Captain, we cannot keep fighting like this. We must retreat. They are stronger than we thought." Varkor's grip tightened on the control panel as he resisted the urge to give in. Retreat. The Quran did not retreat. They conquered. But the human before him, this one human, had shaken the very foundation of his beliefs. For the first time, Varkor felt his fear creeping in, like a shadow in the corner of his mind. Could this one human really bring about their downfall? The human's voice pierced through the air, cutting through the chaos of battle. "You wanted answers. You wanted control. You should have left me to sleep." With one swift motion, the human deflected a series of energy blasts, sending them spiraling back toward their source. The Quran ship's defenses buckled under the force, the hulls groaning as sparks erupted from the damage. Varkor's breath caught in his throat. The human was not just resisting. They were dismantling everything the Quran had built in this moment. Varkor's crew was losing their composure. His soldiers, who had once crushed civilizations without a second thought, were now retreating, hesitating, and even faltering. They had underestimated the human, and now they were paying the price. But Varkor could not back down. Not now. "Hold your ground." Varkor bellowed, trying to rally his forces. "Do not let this human destroy everything we have worked for." The human's cold gaze never wavered as they closed the distance between themselves and the captain. The glowing blade was now a blur of light, moving faster than the Quran could react. With a flick of the wrist, the human sliced through one of the Quran's energy shields, rendering it useless. Varkor's pulse quickened as he realized that the human was no longer just a threat. They were a force of nature, an unstoppable tide that the Quran could not outrun. "You've made a mistake," the human said, their voice low but full of purpose. "You thought you could control the humans. You thought you could wipe us out. But you never understood us." Varkor's mind reeled. The human had said this before, about how the Quran had never understood humanity. But now it was clearer than ever. The Quran had underestimated something far more dangerous than their weapons. They had underestimated the resilience of the human spirit, the unbreakable will that had driven their people to survive time and time again. "You've spent centuries conquering planets, crushing anyone who resists. But you've never fought someone like me," the human continued, their gaze darkening. "And you never will again." Varkor's thoughts were in chaos as the human stepped closer, the blade still glowing with power. The words, the confidence, the sheer force of will. It was as though the human wasn't just fighting to survive. They were fighting for something greater, something beyond themselves. "I'm not here to make deals," the human said, their voice ice cold. "I'm here to make you understand one thing. You don't control us, and you never will again." The room seemed to pulse with an eerie silence as the human's words hung in the air. Varkor was no longer sure if the Quran had the power to stop this human, let alone defeat them. Every time they tried to fight back, the human turned their weapons against them. Every time they thought they were in control, they were reminded of their weakness. "You've been blinded by your own arrogance," the humans spat, their face hardening. "And that will be your downfall." Varkor gritted his teeth. He had no choice but to fight back. The human had challenged everything he knew. They had humiliated him, shown him that his empire, his forces, were not as invincible as he had believed. With a growl of frustration, Varkor activated the final defense system, the ship's core reactor. It would send a shockwave powerful enough to disable the humans' attacks. The energy began to charge, crackling with intensity as Varkor prepared to unleash everything he had. But the human was faster. In an instant, they closed the distance and leaped forward, their blade flashing in the dim light. They slashed through the reactor's energy shield, the force of the blow sending a shockwave of energy throughout the ship. For a brief moment, everything went still. The Quran watched, helpless, as the human continued to stand before them, unaffected by the destruction they had just unleashed. Varkor's eyes widened in horror as he realized that the ship's core had been breached. The power of the reactor was beginning to destabilize. The very ship they relied on for their strength was crumbling before their eyes. "We've made a mistake," Varkor whispered, his voice shaky. "We've underestimated them." But it was too late. The human, still standing tall, looked back at Varkor with a smirk. "I told you, you can't control us." And as the ship's systems began to fail, the Quran captain knew that they had made their final mistake. The collapse of the Quran Empire. The Quran ship was in chaos. Systems were failing, alarms blared through the corridors, and the once pristine control room now felt like a death trap. Varkor, standing at the heart of it all, could feel the weight of his failure pressing down on him with each passing second. The human, this one human, had not only resisted them but was now dismantling everything the Quran had built. The reactor core was dangerously unstable, its power output surging wildly, threatening to rip the entire ship apart. Varkor's crew scrambled to stabilize the failing systems, but the damage was already done. The humans' attack had crippled their ability to fight back, and there was no way to reverse the devastation. Varkor paced back and forth, his mind racing. How had it come to this? How had this fragile human, seemingly out of time, become such a formidable force? The Quran were supposed to be the unstoppable conquerors of the galaxy, feared by all. Yet they were being reduced to nothing more than prey by a single human. The human, still standing tall in the center of the control room, surveyed the destruction they had caused. They had barely broken a sweat. Their blade hummed with a soft energy, almost as if it were absorbing the chaos around them. They had shown no fear, no hesitation. It was as if the human had been waiting for this moment, ready to face the Quran on their own terms. "You don't belong here," the human said, their voice steady and unwavering, despite the chaos swirling around them. "This is not your galaxy to conquer. This is ours to protect. And you are the invader." Varkor clenched his fists, a deep frustration building inside him. "You're deluded," he spat, trying to regain his composure. "You think you can stop the Quran. We are the future. You are nothing more than a relic of the past." The human's eyes narrowed as they slowly approached Varkor. "You still don't get it, do you?" they asked, their voice laced with contempt. "It's not about the past. It's about the future you'll never see if you keep underestimating us." Varkor felt a chill run down his spine as he looked into the human's eyes. There was something in their gaze that unsettled him, something ancient, something that transcended time. The human was right. The Quran had only seen what was in front of them, thinking they could control everything in their path. But they had never considered what might come after. The human raised their blade, its light flashing in the dim glow of the control room. "This ship is done. And you?" they said, voice dropping to a low growl. "You'll never threaten this galaxy again." The power in their words hung heavy in the air. Varkor wanted to argue, to fight back, but the reality was inescapable. The Quran's dominance had been shattered. They had woken up a force far beyond their control, and now the very foundation of their empire was crumbling before their eyes. Turi, the ship's tactical officer, stepped forward, his eyes wide with fear. "Captain, we cannot survive this. The reactor core is already on the brink of collapse. We need to abandon ship or we'll be destroyed along with it." Varkor shook his head. He couldn't accept it. He couldn't accept defeat. But the truth was undeniable. The human had already claimed victory. There was no escaping the consequences of their arrogance. "We're not leaving," Varkor growled, trying to find a solution. "We will fight to the end. We will." Before he could finish his sentence, the ship shuddered violently, the walls shaking as the energy from the reactor core surged once again. Sparks flew from the control panels, and the room was filled with the screeching sound of metal groaning under pressure. "We have to leave," Turi said urgently, pulling Varkor away from the control panel. "Now, Captain, or we will all perish with the ship." The human, still standing in the center of the room, seemed almost amused by the desperation in the Quran's voices. They had no intention of leaving. They knew the Quran had no way out. The ship was doomed. The once feared Quran Empire was on the verge of collapse, and it was all because they had underestimated a single human. "Get out of my way," Varkor snapped, fury in his voice. He refused to surrender. The human might have broken his ship, but they would not break his spirit. He would die with his pride intact. But even as he spoke, the ship began to shake violently, and the sound of tearing metal filled the air. The Quran had no choice. They could either face certain death aboard a ship that was falling apart, or they could escape into the galaxy, leaving behind everything they had once considered their empire. "Captain," Turi shouted again, grabbing Varkor's arm. "It's over." Reluctantly, Varkor turned toward the escape pods. The human hadn't even moved. They were letting the Quran make the choice to flee. The Quran captain knew then that he had lost. The human had already claimed their victory, not by brute force, but by forcing the Quran to confront the reality of their hubris. As Varkor and his remaining crew sprinted toward the escape pods, the human's final words echoed in his mind. "You will never threaten this galaxy again." The Quran ship was destroyed moments later, a massive explosion that lit up the black void of space. But the destruction of the ship was nothing compared to the collapse of the Quran Empire itself. The humans' actions had struck at the heart of their arrogance, and nothing would ever be the same again. The final lesson. The destruction of the Quran ship was not just the collapse of a vessel, it was the end of an empire. As the ship broke apart in space, its once imposing silhouette now reduced to shattered debris, the galaxy was left to witness the consequences of arrogance. But the most important lesson was one that the Quran had never considered. Humans were not to be feared simply because of their strength or intelligence. It was something deeper, something much more dangerous. Their unwavering will to survive and fight for their home. Varkor's escape pod drifted away from the wreckage, carrying only a handful of Quran survivors. The rest of his crew had perished with the ship, victims of their own overconfidence. As the pod traveled through the emptiness of space, Varkor's thoughts were heavy. He had once believed the Quran were unstoppable, that no force in the galaxy could stand against them. Yet in the end, it was the human, the one they had awakened from Cryo sleep, who had proven to be the Quran's downfall. The human's words haunted him. "You can't control us." Varkor had thought they could conquer Earth, that they could bend humanity to their will. They had made the mistake of thinking humans were fragile, that they could be controlled or wiped out. But they had never truly understood the depth of human spirit, their ability to fight, adapt, and rise when all seemed lost. "Why?" Varkor muttered, his voice almost a whisper, his frustration evident. "Why did they do this? What do they want?" Turi, the tactical officer, looked at Varkor with weary eyes. "It's not about what they want, Captain. It's about what we never understood. The humans don't fight for power. They fight to protect what's theirs. And that's something we'll never conquer." Varkor fell silent, the weight of his failure settling deep within him. He had underestimated the human spirit, and now the Karan Empire was nothing but a broken memory. Earth, once a distant planet they had dismissed as insignificant, had turned out to be the catalyst for their downfall. Maybe it's time to let go of the past, Turi continued. Maybe it's time to learn from them. The human was right. We were blind. Varkor stared out into the blackness of space, the remnants of his fleet scattered behind him. He had never been one to admit defeat. The Karan were a proud species, and surrender was a concept foreign to their nature. But now, after everything that had happened, he saw the truth for what it was. The Karan's reign was over, and no amount of pride or force would change that. The galaxy won't forget this, Varkor said quietly. They'll remember how we fell. Turi nodded. And they'll remember who brought us down. The humans. The escape pod drifted through the cold, empty void, carrying the last remnants of a once great empire. Varkor knew that his people would never be the same. The Karan had once ruled with fear and destruction, but now they were just another fallen empire, a cautionary tale for anyone who dared to underestimate humanity.